Recording in progress.
Call the meeting to order. I'll start with a roll call. McKee here, Schultz.
Here.
Behrenkamp.
Here.
Nichols.
Here.
Counselor Bodema is under the weather, so he will not be here tonight. We will go right into the work session topic of rental ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a continuance of our ongoing rental dwelling ordinance discussion. So just a quick background, we decided to pursue this to address the phenomenon of corporate entities buying up large amounts of homes in the Twin Cities. And we wanted to consider the potential for trying to limit the density of rentals within new neighborhoods that are being developed with homeownership in mind, and the importance of an exemption for property owners renting to family members. Next slide. And then that's not the next slide.
Sorry. It's not going.
There we go. The first draft of the rental dwelling ordinance was reviewed back in September, and the council provided a great deal of feedback, including applying a rental license limit to single-family rentals as well as twin homes and townhomes, setting the rental density limit within a neighborhood at 25% of the homes on a block, removing a property management company exemption that was in the original draft, and providing a year to comply with rental licensing requirements with a carve-out for life-saving measures, and researching short-term rental ordinance to see if we could handle Airbnb in an efficient way. Next slide. So the second draft is in front of you tonight, and it includes several changes. We did take out some unnecessary definitions, basically just the family definition. It was based on the HUD definition, and it was confusing, and we didn't really rely on the term elsewhere. So I just went ahead and removed that. We didn't really seem to need that. And then we clarified the rental licensing limit applying to single-family homes, twin homes, and townhomes, removal of the property management company exemption. I created ultimately potentially up to an 18-month compliance timeline. Property owners will have 6 months to submit a rental license application, 12 months from a dated notice following the initial rental inspection to comply with any property maintenance violations, and then a carve-out for life-threatening violations, which would have to comply within 30 days of that dated notice. We talked about having an affidavit process for family members or for property owners that are renting to a family member. I did mention in my last draft I was concerned about that because we have a similar process elsewhere that really does not have any teeth in it. Since then, I did find that other cities, what they rely on is a relative homestead process with Hennepin County, so they would have to register that for tax purposes with the county. And that would be, I think, a much better way, much more efficient, and an easier way for us to enforce the ordinance. So that is what the current draft proposes. The city attorney did add some requirements for designated property management. We changed the rental density limit from 10% to 25%. Made some mostly clarifications and removed redundancies to our maintenance standards and the inspections process. And then added a process for notifying licensees and property owners of maintenance code violations. Next slide. Added a detailed license strike system, which is found under the licensee responsible for conduct of occupants or guests. That has been vetted by the city attorney, and there is a violation fine schedule with $100 for the first violation, $250 for the second, and then $500 for the third. We should probably talk if we want to increase those at all, but that's what I just initially proposed based on a violation schedule we have in code for, I believe it was tobacco licenses. And then added a suburbility and savings clause, just if something were to be found unenforceable, still we're keeping everything else in place. Next slide. So additional components that go along with this. In the packet there was the first draft of the property maintenance code. It is essentially the 2021 International Property Maintenance Code with amendments. I went through that clause by clause with our construction services specialist, Mike, who does have a background in building code. So he had a lot of positive things to say, but he also wasn't afraid to say, no, we don't need that. We don't need that. So I'm pretty confident with the draft that's proposed to you tonight. I did do an hour of short-term rental research as directed. I do think it's a larger discussion that we can definitely have now. We might want to delay things if that is the case, or we can have it as a separate project in 2023 or thereafter. So that's, I provided some research in there for you to take a look at. If it's something we want to continue with, I think we have a great guide, but it is not just a simple paragraph. It's an entirely different license that we would set up. Next slide. And then I have a proposed fee schedule for you. As discussed, it's based on a few cities in the Twin Cities area, tried to find a midpoint for the fees, and then I liked Maple Grove's penalty fee, not really penalties, but they had a reinstatement fee, a penalty for non-renewals, and then a filing fee for appealing a compliance order. And I thought all of that made just administrative sense. So that's what I'm proposing at this point. Next slide. So next steps, I do have access to GIS now, so I will work on getting a density map, which will better provide the block boundaries. I hope to have a draft in January. The short-term rental decision does need to get made because that will depend on what else gets shown to you in January. And then we can work on final revisions and review. And once we have direction to move forward with adoption, I'll also need to work with our licensing software to get a rental license set up in that. So that is what I have.
Perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was a question that came up with how this would apply to incoming development, specifically Cook Lake Highlands. The memory care component, so assisted living facilities and nursing homes in the draft are currently exempt from the licensing process, and I think that would be similar to St. Therese. But the co-op in Cook Lake Highlands, for it to qualify for HUD financing, HUD requires that the units be owner occupied at least 75%. So I think I would have to address the code a little bit, but if we wanted to make it so that the owners, if there's any owners that do want to rent out, and it'll kind of take care of itself that it won't go more than 25% because of the HUD requirements. But we would probably need to change it to apply rental dwelling units to condominiums as well as townhomes and twin homes and single family homes. And we could definitely do that. But I don't see the co-op building as it currently stands being converted completely into a rental just because there's other requirements at play. So, but let me know what questions you have.
Perfect. Thank you.
Very good.
Any questions?
I had a couple. On page 3 of the draft, this is where it goes through the process for getting a special exemption if somebody wanted to have more than 3 rental properties. Mm-hmm. And the way that I read it, it wasn't clear what the grounds the city would use to accept or reject those requests would be. I'm wondering, can this be something that is at sole discretion? Is it something where there has to be some particular category of issue that would be violated by denying it? What are the responsibilities that we have legally to say yes or no? And to what degree can we define that ourselves?
I'm sorry, what page did you say it was on?
Page 3 of 15, it's the
Great.
top Roman numerals II and III.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so these are requirements that the city attorney laid out. The original draft that I had sent him did not really have that even fleshed out to this extent. So this is, he recommended having some standard, but also recognizing that we want to give the city council some discretion in this. Ultimately, the ordinance as it's written is saying 25%, you don't have by right the ability to rent. It would have to be a special exemption. As I said before, this is a part of law that's unclear how it'll be upheld if it were to ever go to court. there's just no court decision that has ruled on it one way or the other. But the city attorney did look this over and felt that these were some reasonable standards. We could definitely try to carve it out further if you have some ideas. But I think the idea was to try to keep some discretion. I think the idea is this would be used for, well, this is more the rental license limit, not the density exemption, I apologize. But the three, I think, would be mostly used for landlords that have a good experience, don't really have a lot of violations. There would probably be something that we'd point to, like, no, we're really not comfortable giving you more rental licenses in the city. So I think that it should be okay based on conversations with the city attorney as it's written, but we can definitely add more.
Okay. My thought process on it was, it kind of harkens back to the language that was here before, related to if you've got a property management company, then it's okay. Which doesn't really speak to the purpose that we had for creating the regulation at the beginning, which was more around how do we ensure good opportunity for ownership within the city, and trying to avoid much of the single-family housing being acquired by large corporations. So I'm wondering, can there be something in addition to this that could be used as a criteria? Like, there should be a net benefit to the public through the grant of the permit to extend beyond the 3. So it still gives you some framework to have a discussion around, but it goes beyond just, do you have the ability to keep the grass cut and the house painted?
I would be happy to discuss that with the city attorney and see how we could add something like that in there.
My other question on this section was mobile homes, and if that would be treated any differently, given,
No, so that was something I went back and forth with the city attorney. So essentially, the idea is we're putting in a rental ordinance in place to make sure people have, we have a couple goals, but one of the goals being people have proper places to live that meet certain standards. It should apply to all properties, not just, giving mobile homes an exclusion might actually be making matters worse for an already blighted area. So this would apply. We might need to give them, probably going to need to work with them a lot longer than a year, so maybe that's something I can carve out a bit further in the draft, how the timeline would be to bring them into compliance, since it's a much
more extensive?
Yeah, a much more extensive process, but I do think it would, if we're going to do this, we should commit to it, and they would be, those residents would be included in the keeping standards nice throughout the city.
What about the limit on 3 per entity?
So currently, I would say that would not apply to mobile homes, the 3 per entity.
But the others
First
would.
of all, it's one park owner. So he would have a license, it's interesting. I would say it would be a license for the park and we would do it per unit, but that definitely could be carved out a bit further. That's a great point. But, because he's ultimately the property owner.
He's not the unit owner, though.
No, you're right. So
But in
that's,
some cases, he could be.
No,
Like, he
I-
might own 20, say,
That's
and then
true.
rent those.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
but to your point, that's correct. There's people who own those trailers that ultimately, just because they're leasing the land, doesn't mean, the park owner would be responsible for that rental unit if it were to be a rental. So it would have to go based on whoever the property owner is, and I think, we would need to have an that would be a perfect example where we would give someone an exemption. Because that doesn't make sense to make the park owner not give him those licenses. But I would also say the exemption is for single-family townhomes and twin homes, and there might be some room to argue that a mobile home is a bit different than that. I think that's great. I definitely need to work on carving that out a bit further with the mobile home, so I can do that.
And a couple minor points. On page 1, the definition of apartment says, a community complex or building having a common owner and containing at least one rental dwelling unit. That seems like it would also include single-family homes and townhomes, so we might need a little bit of revision to the definitions.
Okay.
And I didn't see single-family or townhome defined.
Okay. Okay.
And then on page 4, number 2, This looks like it might be a holdover from the previous draft. The owner must notify the city within writing, within 30 days of this exemption being lost because the occupant is not related to the owner. I'm not sure that would still apply if we're going to use Hennepin County's homestead classification.
I would argue that it does still apply, because we should still be notified if that relative homestead status goes away, and we might not be notified by Hennepin County right away. So it should, I would argue that the property owner has the responsibility to let us know that they've started renting to someone that's not a family member.
Okay. Maybe it just needs to get reworded then.
Okay.
Reworded to what?
Well, there's not a requirement that the person is a family member that's explicit. We used to have that, but now it's just the homestead status with the county. So you might need to just revise it so it refers to if the homestead
refer
status
back.
changes, then.
I think that makes sense, yeah.
So that's all the stuff that I saw in the document. I know you wanted feedback on the short-term rental ordinance, and I had a clarifying question on that element of it. For short-term rental, would they go through this same process to make the property eligible to be rented on a short-term basis? Or would that not be required?
That's a great question. I think that would be part of what needs to get answered. I would assume there needs to be some kind of inspection in place, because they're basically using it as a B&B or a hotel. So I would say there needs to be some kind of inspection, but it'd probably be a slightly different process and a slightly different license. Yeah, I don't really have much more of an answer than that. An hour of reresearch didn't get me
Yeah, that's-
very far into it, I apologize.
I think some of the basic safety elements that are inherent in this process would still be important to have for short-term rental.
Right,
I don't think that we're at a point now, given there's maybe 1 or 2 short-term rentals in the city, that it's urgent that we develop something specifically for that.
right.
So I think I would be open to having the language just require, if you're going to have short-term rental, you need to have a license.
Okay.
And it has to go through the same inspection. But I wouldn't add any additional restrictions or requirements at this time, and we can always do that separately. That's just my initial take on it. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts.
So they'd be subject to the same penalties and fines that we talked about for, what was it? Another example, you had of violations for a first offense, second offense, and third offense in 24 months. That might be hard to do if you don't have much control over who you're renting to. You don't do a background check on somebody that's going to apply for an Airbnb on any given day. So luck of the draw may have you paying some pretty good fines.
Yeah.
So you would suggest just holding it out of this, and then if we wanted to address it, do it separately?
Well, I agree with Councilmember Nichols on the safety aspect, right? There's been several cases where Airbnbs where people have died because of carbon monoxide and whatnot. So we have a duty to the people that are staying there that we make sure that they're safe, but
Sure.
whether the short-term rental ordinance should be worded exactly as the long-term, I think we might have to take a deeper dive into that.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Did I cut you off?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, another question. If we were to just basically require the same license for short-term versus long-term, my other question would be, are we capping density of short-term rentals the same way? So if there's already 2 homes that are long-term rentals, would the short-term rental count towards that same density limit of 25%? And then also if the license cap would also count towards that. So if that makes sense for the how many licenses a single entity can have. I think that makes sense. Just want to make sure, if a entity owns a short-term rental and 2 long-term rental, that's their 3, or do we have a different carve out for they can have 2 short-terms and 3 long-term? So those would be questions I have in administrating it.
I wouldn't see a strong argument to increase the overall level of rentals in the city to accommodate short-term. I would probably just keep it common to one program. because it's still taking housing off of the market to have it short-term versus long-term. You're still having the same concerns about people who, the owner may need the support of the city in ensuring conformance and having a clause to be able to ensure that if somebody is regularly violating the law, there's a mechanism to deal with that. But again, it's not as big of a concern immediately, I think, given that it's not a huge market in Corcoran today. We may feel differently in 10 years.
Yeah, and I'd want to make sure whatever we do on short term isn't too onerous on people, because you may have a lot of people that want to just do it one weekend a year or something like that. You know, if an event comes along, that would be in this area. Bottom Speedway holds the Grand Nationals or something there, but
We could do a carve out so that it only applies to people who are doing, I mean, sometimes you see things where the short-term rental is really only considered that if it's rented out more than 30 calendar nights in a year.
Yeah.
So we could have that kind of cutoff, so anyone who's just doing it as a one-off, really, that wouldn't be something that we're really licensing. It'd be for the people who are doing it regularly. Now, there might be, you know, the safety aspect still might be there, but if that's, you know, one way to remove that threshold or that burden, if it's just someone looking to do a one-time thing and just try it out, maybe. So.
Yeah,
That seems reasonable to me.
I could support that.
During the Super Bowl, that was one of the short term where people were renting out just on that very short term. In a lot of places, they were renting out to a lot more people than what were safe to be renting to. And so, you know, we didn't face those issues, but talking to some of the other communities that didn't have a good short-term rental ordinance in place struggled, because especially the closer you got towards the Super Bowl, you would have, people would have an apartment and they'd be trying to put 10, 15 people in there, or and they don't have inspections, and again, you get to the carbon monoxide concerns or some of that other stuff. But some of those short-term ones, people get a little bit more lax on the safety things, which, you know, it's what weighing risk, I suppose, or responsibility.
yeah.
They'd be running the same risk with their own lives at least. So hopefully there's some standard there. But
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if this, I think I agree with the main points that you guys have raised. Would that put us leaning towards including it in this and maybe taking the time to sort out those details before passing anything, or looking at it as a separate thing 6 months down the road or something?
Yeah, I think we could look at it as a separate thing later on, because I
Okay.
don't think it fits into the spirit of what we're trying to do here. And part of I mean, you raised a point about the part about home ownership opportunities, but the biggest thing for me is the safety aspect of it and the community aspect about, you know, the homes that are being rented, to make sure that they're safe for the people that are occupying them. And, you know, they're not changing the character of the community that they're going into. I know that was a big thing in my area when a house became a rental for probably 3 years. It really changed the character of our community in that time frame. And it kind of, the property deteriorated to the point where you wondered how safe it was for the people that actually lived in it. So I think that, to me, is the main goal, those 2 points. And short-term rental, I think we could address separately, personally.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I lean the same way, because again, I don't think we might not see any if we delay the short-term rental, doing something on that first 6 months or a year, whatever, however long it takes, whatever it is. There might not be any in that time frame that come up.
yeah, I would be okay with that too.
Okay. Other than that, great job, Natalie. This was a lot of work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think it's a good,
There were
on
a
the
couple
right
of
track.
things that I had, I guess, or be interested in council feedback on a couple of the items in there. One of the things that we, on page 4, number 4, where it talks about chapter not applying to single-family homes in which the owner resides, which I think is, you know, if we are deviating from the 2 unrelated or whatever that standard is, the only thing I would caution against is sometimes you would end up with either an owner purchase or a, you know, seen parents buying homes for their kids, and you get 5, 6, 8 unrelated living in the house, and that it turns into some, a flop house or something like that, where it's essentially functioning as a rental. Now, there is that balance between, well, maybe having an owner-occupied rental helps with the home ownership, which is part of the spirit of what the rental ordinance is for, but we've also seen the neighborhood impact when you start having 5, 6, 8 college guys and impacting the neighborhood of that many unrelated parties. So there can be a downside to moving away from the unrelated standard, and maybe just something to consider that if we're gonna walk that back, is there any cap on number of unrelated? And think of it even in some of, you can create any scenario, but there's certain ones where people would be renting, but the owner would be living in it and still kind of functioning as a, either short-term as a hostel or long-term as a long-term kind of flop house. So that was one of the things that we brought up. Another one was, in reading through it, the requirement for the property manager to live in the 7-county metro. I don't know if there's a better way, or with the conversation with this city attorney on just the thought process, I guess. I mean, if you owned a rental if you were the manager of a rental in Corcoran, you could live in Hastings, but you couldn't live in Hanover because it's outside the 7-county metro.
I see. Okay, so more like a 50-mile radius would be?
Well, whatever is
Okay.
prudent, I think that would be just,
Sure.
maybe look at,
Centering it a little more as
Yeah,
opposed to.
no, I think that's fair.
so I think that was, sorry.
I was just gonna say, so with something like that, though, I could see a lot of cases where somebody moves out of the area but doesn't decide to sell their house, right? They move to their vacation home, they don't need to sell their house, they want to maintain it and use it as an income stream. Now, all of a sudden,
That was a requirement. for the manager.
So yeah, the property management, so they would need a designated property manager that can be basically called to the property if there's a serious violation at any point, or can basically be their agent should a violation occur and they want to have a hearing or something. So basically someone who is in Minnesota, that was the attempt to be, so it's a little different than the property owner. So if the property owner leaves the state, then they would need to designate someone who can, whether it's a family member or a property management company that can easily respond to the city saying there's a problem on the property.
And they outlined it, authorized to accept notices and formal service of documents on behalf of the licensee, so.
What page is that on?
For instance, if we didn't know where they were, it looks like bottom of 4 going into 5. And I think that they're looking for somebody with authority to, if there's an ongoing nuisance, that they have authority to resolve the issues on the property. So we used to deal with this in Mankato, as if we had, for instance, an underage party where there was 400 people there, and there was no homeowner to be found, that there was somebody that could come in and had the authority to kick the people out of the home and bring it back to a state of order. And that was kind of that was more of how the property manager clause, I think, is intended, not as a restriction from letting people do it, but who do you go to resolve problems?
So could a person just designate somebody as a property manager that's actually living in the home?
But they don't need to live in the home, they just need to live.
So let me give you an example, right? So I'll give you an example. My brother-in-law buys a home for his daughter in college. Daughter goes there 4 years of school, he keeps the home, but he doesn't live anywhere near it. But he's renting it to people that are responsible, but he needs a property manager to manage that home. Could he just say, okay, Mr. Occupant number 1, I'm designating you as the property manager as long as you live in this home?
Yeah, I think the way that it's written, that he could do that, that might lead to problems within his own lease, because how do you kick out your property manager? So there would probably be benefits to making sure that it's someone who is a little more distant from the situation. But there's nothing preventing that. It could be someone in the home, it could be a family member, it could be, like I said, a property management company is typically what I've seen when I've rented a single-family home. It was in Minneapolis, and the owner was in Oregon, And so she went through a property management company, and they were the ones that dealt with the heat went out, so that's
Yeah.
who I called. So it's also, it's for the tenant as well to have a
Yeah.
representative who can easily, within 24 hours, respond to a situation.
Okay, but the requirement is that they have to live in the 7-county metro based on this so far?
Right, yeah, currently, that was what the city attorney and I had put in the draft. I think that's a great point, that that might be arbitrary, considering where we're located, so we could change that to like a 100-mile radius. So, or with, maybe it's a 120-mile radius, so it's a 2-hour drive, like no more than 2 hours out, so,
Yeah.
okay.
The only other thing was that you guys, I know you contemplated the mobile home park, if they're owning multiple trailers. There could also be a scenario where there's an outside person that starts buying up homes within their 10, that could own 5, 10, more than 3 units within the park, using that as a rental income. And is there a distinguishing factor to allow the park owner to own more than 3, but not somebody else within there, and whether or not that's your desired outcome, if it is the spirit of trying to keep homes, available for individuals? That's probably something to consider. And the other one was at the bottom of, you talked about the licensee responsible for conduct of occupants. I think the way the draft is, it has the Director of Public Safety in charge of that part of compliance, and just maybe conversations if it should remain there or if it should still remain in the same lane, and just with public safety provides the information to the person who does the inspections or things like that. And maybe just, is there a cleaner way so there's one point of contact, or do we want to split parts of that out to different responsible authorities in the city?
I think that's a great point, that I think the city attorney drafted that, and I kept it as is, but maybe it's more of a, in coordination with the public safety director.
Yeah, we can talk to the city attorney about that too, because we can certainly share the police reports or that whatever would indicate a violation with the rental compliance, and they could, move forward that way too. So I think there's just a couple of cleanup mechanics that we can look at.
Yeah, you might wanna, it might be worth looking in, asking Barry about lease agreements with regards to mobile home parks, because there might be right in their own lease agreements that they can't, you have to be owner occupied. Otherwise he would have somebody coming in and doing that exact same thing, and probably just doesn't jive with his business model.
Worth looking into.
Yeah, I can reach out.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the Hennepin County, the homestead? This is a classification that they reach out for?
Yeah, so there's, let me pull it up. So basically, it's the same process to homestead. It's just you would say that it's a family member, and they have more, let's see here. They have a form to fill out for the relative homestead on Hennepin County, so we would just direct them to that. And then, as long as it's for tax purposes registered as a homestead, relative homestead, then for our purposes, we would consider that exempt. We would still, likely, for our purposes, just ask for a record of the recent homestead status, so we have that on file, but I don't really think the affidavit process would have really been all that great, just knowing how it's been used elsewhere. It just hasn't, people sign the form and not really paying attention to what it's actually saying,
So do they have to submit some type of affidavit when they apply for that credit? The homestead status?
Let me see if I can find the form.
It's an application form, which I think that there is some language on there.
Yeah. Thought I had it. Apply online.
I'm assuming falsifying information is probably a misdemeanor or something.
Yeah, and if people are gonna fall, unfortunately, there's going to be people that do that, but I think just removing some of the administrative burden on staff. I mean, it's something that they would already have to do for their tax purposes, so I think it would take care of most situations.
I mean, it's in the same boat as the question that Matt raised about non-related people renting, right? I mean, comes down to it, I suppose they could just say, well, I'm not renting, I'm just staying here.
Yeah, so, and then I think, sometimes those situations kind of take care of themselves where there's a code violation on the property. Like, I'm working through something right now where the property is registered as a homestead and, there was a code violation that was due to a tenant that's living there. And he reached out saying, hey, I'm a tenant, the landlord doesn't live here. So, so I think that those kind of situations will take care of themselves when it comes up, and we're maybe not gonna catch all of it, but I think, we'll be able to catch enough of it that it's worthwhile, so.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I can't say thank you enough for everything you've done to get to this point. There's a lot of work and stuff. The only question I have, I like Alan's question about that homestead side. I know we've got a number of properties in town that a single owner owns, and there's people staying at each of those properties and stuff. So that's all result here. Have we had any input back about us going down this road from any landowners, residents, any tenants, anybody asking about this
I think there was one.
and their input on that?
Yeah,
the only thing I was-
I forgot, when exactly there was an email, but there was an email
Yeah.
that we included at the dais last session that had had some questions about the practicalities. I feel like we've worked through a lot of that.
Okay.
I think Kendra received a call from a landowner who was wondering if his rental properties would be exempt because they're grandfathered in, and that's not how a rental ordinance would be applied. It's not a land use per se.
Right.
In terms of like a non-conforming use or something like that. So yes, it would apply to existing rental.
This would be,
Across the
when
board.
this goes, it would be the new bar, and it would be a blanket to everyone that's renting. I think you had said we've got 100 and
They would have.
how many properties
Oh,
rented right now, so to speak?
yeah, I can pull that data up. I can't remember what it is, but I think
It's like
my
117, I think
conservative
you
estimate
said.
was about 100.
Okay.
And then assuming half of those are to family members.
All right.
There's probably about 50 that we can expect for licenses. That's some very conservative estimations. But that's my best guess at this point.
Okay, and roughly cost per rental and a license is $100 and some dollars.
Yeah, so it would be essentially $200 to get set up, $100 for renewals, and then it's $75 for any inspection beyond the initial inspection, because that will cover the staff time to get out there and process everything.
And that's a summary, and do we have people listening right now? Anybody?
We have one
Okay.
participant on, and I believe they're related to a group that owns property in town.
Okay, no, I'm asking, but again, the stuff that's written, everything that's been brought up, this is a work in process, even if we bless something and put something in place. I think it's something that we will continually evolve as things happen and occur here. So thank you guys for everybody that's been part of this. It's a tremendous amount of work.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I imagine this goes before planning commission, there'll be a public hearing.
No, so we are not, it's not in the subdivision or zoning ordinance.
Oh.
It'd be to the business license with the rental dwelling, and then the property maintenance code is our general code where our nuisances are housed. So we can hold a public hearing, but I don't
No.
believe either of those is required.
There is not to my knowledge, there's not a requirement for those. If that's something council would like to see us do, we certainly can do that.
But I would say it's not in the planning commission's purview, so it'd be,
It'd likely be a public hearing
here.
at a
Council meeting.
council meeting,
Yeah.
more than likely.
Great question.
It'd probably be worth having
Yeah,
some
I think
public
so.
input on it. And there's a lot of information here, and I can honestly tell you, with the shortened the week, I didn't
Yeah.
get a chance to read through it. I
Yeah.
focused on the agenda packet for tonight, so.
Yeah, I had
there's
to
a
do
lot
some,
more information I'll have to read.
had to do some prioritized skimming in certain areas.
Fair
Every day.
enough.
And I would say maybe just also giving some thought on the 118.08, which is the license denial, suspension, revocation, that this draft doesn't outline presumptive revocation after a certain number of violations, that it might be something to consider as far as from what I'm reading, unless I'm
It
reading it incorrectly.
should've.
It just says the city has the option to, which,
Yeah, after the first one, and that was the city attorney, so after the first one, we have the option to revoke it.
and so typically what I would, what a lot of cities do is they'll say, okay, after 3, you lose your rental license, and the city can choose, hey, there's extenuating circumstances, we're gonna choose not to revoke it, but that would be at the appeal of at the property owner. And it's really kind of setting that threshold for how much do neighborhoods per se have to endure before the council takes action versus, I think, leaving some leeway in there. And I think what the experience has been in the past is the councils in cities that didn't spell that out struggled with, the individual basis that came in, and all of a sudden you have one person that, 4 law violations. And we can say this with a clean slate. We currently don't have any properties in Corcoran that from a occupant performance standard is the part that would fall under the police department, that would qualify as being a problem or a nuisance property. But once you start getting them, the appropriate amount becomes really hard and starts to look arbitrary. If one person, you say, we're gonna revoke your license after 3 here, but not 6 with this individual. So I think the more structure going into it and leaving the leeway to make appropriate accommodations helps provide some framework, especially if it's a scenario where it's after the people who created the ordinance aren't on the council when that application comes in.
Yeah, so fair enough. The language in it right now that the city attorney proposed was if a third or subsequent violation involving the same tenant, occupant, or guest occurs within 12 months of 2 previously properly noticed violations, city council may take action to deny, revoke, suspend, and not renew. Whether or not, I think he wanted to avoid it being automatic and then having to appeal to make sure that their due process rights are being upheld, and we do have, so I think the idea is it would automatically be a hearing at that point to decide what kind of
What section
action.
is that one?
So that is.
Page 12, number 4.
Yeah.
Okay, so up under the enforcement of the licensee
Yeah,
conduct.
yeah.
And I was looking under the revocation. I think the due process burden is met by having an appeal process to the council, I would say. So I would, and we can talk with John about that recommendation as well, about what
Okay.
the best way to do is. I think you've seen it gets to be that slippery slope because you don't want to be arbitrary, I think is the biggest thing. So I think creating that framework provides the appearance of being arbitrary. So, and that's certainly whatever you guys feel would be comfortable.
I would be comfortable with the default after 3 being revocation,
Okay.
but maybe you have it require a hearing, so there is due process, and they can appeal at that time. So they don't have to request a hearing, but it's just part of the process, just automatically scheduled instead of at discretion.
So, so the default is revocation and a hearing in front of the council where they can have discretion to discuss other options. Okay. All right, I can talk with Thames about that.
Is it just 3 violations within 12 months?
Yeah, 3 violations of the criminal, so we're not talking about property maintenance codes,
Yeah, no, but
except for some noise nuisances, but that's not property maintenance, but,
I wonder if you can structure it more, because 3 months and 12-month time frame. What happens if the 3rd violation comes in at the 13th month?
Then it
And
would
you start the
start
clock over again, right?
mm-hmm.
And
I'd rather it be within 12 months, and it's a rolling type deal instead of
yeah, that's-
January to January.
No, I'm sorry, so I misunderstood. It is so it's been a 12-month period. So if the first violation happened April 1st, and the 3rd violation April 1st, 2022, the 3rd violation comes in May 2nd, May 2nd, 2023, then that 3rd violation really is a separate clock that's starting, like the 12-month period would start over on that violation.
Or are you thinking something like?
I'd
additional
want it to
language that
stay
says,
rolling.
Or 5 violations in a X year period, as well as.
Well, the rolling should take care of
Okay.
that, but I guess my point was gonna be is that 3 violations are 3 violations that, they're criminal violations, right? So,
Yeah, and I guess it depends on how you want it. I mean, in other cities that I've worked for, they counted property performance strikes as well, or they would count as a half a strike or something like that. So if the city was having to go and mow the property, you know, and that would count as either a half a strike or it would count as, you know, so it depends on how we write it as to what's determined. I think the way it's written currently is criminal. But in other cities, they do count property maintenance performance. So if there's piles of junk and scrap motor vehicles and weeds growing, that those could count, you know, the abating the lawn could be a half a strike and the junk abatement would be a half a strike in some cities, so.
Yeah, so my only concern with that is really property maintenance is the responsibility of the landlord. Even if the occupant is causing a situation, in my mind, we can talk about we can probably talk about a strike against the license, but I don't want, if the landlord isn't mowing the lawn, I'm concerned about it, because right now it's talking about the conduct of occupants.
But the landlord would be losing their rental license if they didn't mow the lawn. The sanction is against the landlord.
Yeah.
For the property performance.
yeah.
Okay.
I think the big thing is that I'm thinking about is that people endure a lot more than just the violations that are being reported, right? There's a lot of things that go on that that don't reach the level of criminal or whatnot that people have to endure around them. And a lot of times those aren't reported, but people have to live with them, and we'd like to be able to deal with that in a manner.
I like the half-strike concept,
For property
or property item.
maintenance. Okay.
And I would suggest maybe we do 3 strikes over 18 months instead of 12.
Okay.
Don't object to it.
Yeah, I just don't want to get it too long because,
Yeah, I'd rather go with, if you get your first one in May, your second one in December, your third one in February, or excuse me, your third one June of the next year, the calendar starts with the one in December.
No, it would roll.
No,
So
it
you'd-
would-
That's what I want as far as rolling.
And
You would look back 12 months, the way that
Yeah,
it's
you would look
drafted.
back 12
for the
months.
first
You
violation.
always look back 12 months from the last violation. We're saying the same thing. I don't want it to
Yeah.
be January to January. I want it to
Be
be,
any
here's a
3 violations in
violation.
a 12-month period.
Have they had 3 previous? Okay, good. Nope, we're saying the same. I'm just different, so thank you. I like the have to related to appearance, maintenance, those kind of things.
And I think a 12-month period could make sense in terms of usually leases are for a 12-month period, so that we're not holding an occupant, you know, if it was just, I mean, sometimes occupants stay for a long term, that's definitely true, but a lot of times renters are moving on a year-to-year basis too.
Yeah, that's.
So
another one.
that way we're not saying that.
But it says the same tenant
Same
in the draft. So if the tenant changed, then it would automatically reset. You might have a problem, though, if they just
Yep.
change who the tenant is, but it's the same group of people, so.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's.
But they could do that anyway with any period of time.
So the city attorney thought that through then.
Yeah, you guys are on it. It's good to talk it out too.
So, did we say 12-month or 18-month then for that?
I'd prefer to stick with a shorter term.
The
I
12
would,
months?
I would rather short.
Okay.
I'm fine with either, I think.
So that's a lower bar, right? You're
Yeah.
clear on that?
Yeah, because if you're living next to somebody you're going through that, 6 months can seem like an eternity.
Well, that's why I suggested 18 months, so that it would
It would
look back
count more.
farther for additional instances.
Oh,
So the higher standard for the tenant performance would be a longer term
well,
look
that's
back.
true. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I'll go with that.
I will
18 months?
too. Yeah.
Okay.
Dean, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I'll rescind what I said and say, I want it to be
A little more stringent.
stringent. I didn't
Okay.
think that way.
Okay.
I I'm stuck in it.
No, I know
over
how
here.
you were
I'm sorry.
thinking that. I
You don't think like those people, huh?
No, you're giving me all kinds of neat ideas for another application outside.
So it sounds like we would like to bring back a third draft with the block map in January. Does that sound?
That sounds good.
Okay. So, we'll probably schedule another work session for that then.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can schedule another work session and figure out where we would put that short-term rental piece. Keep it on our list for.
Oh, yeah,
look
as a
at that
possible
as
priority.
I think there's maybe a
As-
lot we can
Future,
copy paste into that as
Yeah.
as baseline and then
but
figure out what
just
we.
where that ends up on our priority scale for next year, just
Mm-hmm.
as we're thinking about that for next year, that would be.
Hopefully, we're not getting any more Super Bowls for a while. I'm pretty confident.
Yeah, I don't.
World's Fair.
There you go.
That's fair.
With World's Fair.
I think we'll have bottom of Raceway before that time.
Now that is a big something going on there. Is it actually?
Bloomington's
World's Fair?
applying for Earth's, trying to get the World's Fair.
Yeah.
I forget what year it was, but
Should go for the World Cup.
there we go.
Do better than
There we go.
what's going on now.
And Ellen, to your question, there is a fine or up to $3,000 penalty if you falsify your homestead.
Oh, thank you.
I was
for
able
figuring
to
that out.
find, they have you apply online, but after many clicks, I was able to find a PDF version where I could read all the rules.
Thank you.
Going down that road, I don't want to take up a lot more time, but how much money does the city receive off a non-homestead property compared to a homestead property? Is it exponentially
Depends on the
more?
value.
It depends
Yeah.
on the
It basically
Caps out
shelters your
pretty-
property value a little bit.
It caps out at like 400 and some thousand.
Yeah, there is some value in non-homesteaded properties, but I don't know off the top of my head. but we
That's all
can
right.
follow up.
Thanks.
It seems pretty minor, I think, the difference.
I guess on the flip side of that, would there be a concern if there's not a significant benefit to them tax-wise to be filing it as such, that they just wouldn't file that?
You can only have one homesteaded property.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're not living in it, they would kind of be wasting
True.
that.
Yeah. You're probably right. That probably takes care of it. Never
But
mind.
is that entirely true? You can own a bunch of properties and be ag and farm them all, and,
But they aren't
You
homesteaded.
can't homestead them all.
but they're still at a lower tax rate if you're farming all of those properties,
Because it's agriculture.
because it's ag.
Yeah, that's a different issue.
Okay.
Or
And
a different.
And there is a bit of a difference between ag homesteading and residential homesteading. So that's something I could probably get an answer on from the assessor's office.
Well, and I think in situations where it's truly a family member renting to a family member, they're gonna be in a situation where they want every penny they can, like any relief that they can have tax-wise. I think it is enough of an incentive to have everything by the book. And then if they don't think it's worthwhile to register, then they would be licensed. So I think it would take care of some of the administrative aspect to see who truly qualifies for that exemption and who is trying to work the system. So,
Works for me. Anything else? Okay, I think we have a game plan for next steps. Appreciate all the work, Natalie.
Thank you.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Recording stopped.